Okay, so tonight, this is one of my favorite arguments for God's existence. And the reason is it's not heavy philosophy, there's no science, and we've been doing a lot of science the last 3 weeks. And if you're not into science, you don't care, or it's harder to maybe get excited about the cosmological argument or the design argument because how much you realize in science. The neat thing about this one is every single person has moral considerations. Atheists have to think about these things. So there's nobody you're ever going to talk to who's going to be completely uninterested in morality. And that means it's a good entry point to everybody. It's intuitive, it's something that it's an immediate, between this and knowing that you're talking about God, it's a quicker jump. You don't have to go through long syllogisms like you do with some of the other ones. So for those reasons, I just like this argument. My favorite is actually the cosmological because I do like science and it's kind of cool to talk about stars and planets and all that kind of stuff. But I understand that not everybody cares about that stuff. So first I wanted to do a quick review. I'm going to go quicker than usual this time, but I like to do that each week to build on. Is everybody reading the book? I don't do like quizzes and stuff to check and see, but at the same time I also purposely go along with the book, but I don't just regurgitate everything in the book because that is boring. So I won't make you raise your hand if you're not reading it. But does anybody have any questions or things that you really liked from the book? I highlight the heck out of things when I'm reading. So anybody else have anything that they got from the book that you haven't heard brought up in class? I want to make sure we keep that up. No? Okay. Either you're not reading it or it's perfectly crystal clear. Okay, so the classical apologetics, and the important thing to just be aware of here so that you're talking to other Christians who do other kinds of apologetics. You might hear people say evidentialism apologetics, presuppositional apologetics, and there's another one called cumulative case, but hardly anybody does that or argues for it. Our classical apologetics is this model that we're doing, that the book does. This is the kind of apologetics that most apologists have been traditionally. Evidential means that you typically will start right with the resurrection. We'll try and prove the resurrection. But does anybody remember the problem with jumping right to the resurrection?
I don't believe I believe in Jesus.
And even if someone did rise from the dead, if God doesn't exist, then
Right.
there's just some explanation we haven't found out about yet. Richard Howell likes to joke that, who knows, maybe every third leap year, in the Middle East on that day, people rise from the dead. This is the most publicized one. We don't know. There's some principle of biology or cosmos. They could say that it's absurd and ludicrous for someone to retreat to that, but when you do it this way, you start with, well, we've already talked about this truth exists, so you can't get into the whole postmodern touchy-feely, well, that's your beliefs. I'm glad you found what's important to you, but what's important to me, the whole individual truth. Now we're in the section of, does God exist? So if you demonstrate first to somebody that God exists, then you show that the resurrection happened. They can't say, well, God didn't raise Jesus from the dead, because they've already gotten to the point of realizing, okay, that God does exist, or at least conceding that point. And if God exists, then he can, if a theistic God exists, that he can act in our history, in our time. And then we deal with, well, the Bible says, that's when we get into the evidences for the resurrection and the reliability of the New Testament and Old Testament, archaeology, stuff like that. Those are fun. A lot of what we're going to talk about tonight is part of that last question I put down there as an asterisk because it is in the book, but it's not part of the 13-point or 12-point argument. But I don't know who isn't asking the question, why is there so much suffering in the world? Even atheists, even Buddhists, even Buddhism actually, interestingly, Buddhism was born out of this question. Siddhartha Gautama was overwhelmed with suffering. Why is there so much suffering in the world? And his answer was, because suffering is an illusion. All reality is an illusion, and so you suffer because you think this is real. the world around you, your relationships with people, you're in love with your children, you're in love with your spouse, and it's that love that anchors you to this fake world, and this world has suffering in it. So the way to get out of suffering is to realize this is all just an illusion, and once you get enlightened and you realize that, you cease to exist, you don't get reincarnated anymore. So Buddhism is actually very negative, like the world is horrible, the best way to deal with it is to not be attached to it anymore. That was what he argued. Then there's, so his whole project was an answer to why is there so much suffering in the world. Darwin, his whole premise, we talked about that 2 weeks ago, I think it was, his whole project was, I see suffering in the animal kingdom, I see suffering in our lives, there's no God, because no God would allow that much suffering, so I have to come up with some scientific theory as to why there's so much suffering and why that's better for life to exist. That's his whole project, was a philosophical journey initially. It's scientific theory, but he was motivated by the philosophy. So it's interesting that some of the worst things in mankind's thinking come from, what about suffering and pain? Why is there so much suffering and pain? It's important to have that ready to bring up, because it's not just us as Christians that have to answer that. So why does God allow so much suffering? Well, let's talk about that. But first, let me ask you, if there's no God, why is there so much suffering? We both are experiencing that suffering. We all have loved ones who have died or are dying or suffer, things like, with my dad with Alzheimer's, or people with cancer that discovered too late, or everybody is touched by suffering and pain in our own lives, and personally, or people that we love. So, Mr. Non-Believer, why do you think there's so much suffering? And we'll talk about that separately. But tonight we're going to be talking about the moral argument for God's existence. So we're on number 2 still, but there's a lot of overlap of what we're going to do tonight with what we're going to do after we're done with the New Testament. So stick around, come back, it gets even better when we deal with that. Okay, so quick overview. Does truth exist? Well, we know truth exists, at least at this level. It's objective, and we know it because you can't deny any one of those 3 without using all 3 of them. I won't belabor that, but anyway, if anybody has any questions or wants to go through thought exercises again, we can. The cosmological argument, one of the cosmological arguments, is everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe did have a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. The hidden premises in there, though, is by the universe we mean time, space, all material things. And so since none of those things existed, whatever brought those things into existence can't be physical, because everything physical came into existence. It can't be in time, because time came into existence, so it's eternal. And it can't be in space, so it's not height, width, depth. So the cause already has several attributes of theistic God, the Christian God. Right, with one argument. That's why I love this one so much, because Buddhism's false, because Buddhism says the universe is eternal. Mormonism's false, because they have an infinite regress of gods and people who became gods. So many belief systems are just, nope, they can't be the case. Pantheism in Native American religions, Shintoism, when you believe that spirits can inhabit rocks and rivers and things like that. So much of what humans have believed through the millennia are just false by one argument. Doesn't mean Christianity is true yet, but it's one of the few contenders left. The design argument means that this cause of the universe that has all those other attributes also intended mankind to be here at this time in history. So it looks like all this great majesty that we see had Earth in its crosshairs, which means that there's something about us that's different or special. Special not in the humanist sense, like we're the point of all of existence, but we're the point of creation, it seems. And the design argument shows that the universe, anything that has design, shows design, has a designer. The universe shows design. We as humans, anything biological, animals show design, so there's a designer behind them. So the universe as a whole, though, has a designer because of that same fine-tuning that we see. So now you've got a God who's eternal, not physical, all those things, but also extraordinarily intelligent to fine-tune everything perfectly, and then to execute the development of life so that we would be here. So this being is incredibly powerful and intimately involved in our showing up on the scene, because all sorts of things had to be exactly right for humans to be here right now. So this being started to get uncomfortable for atheists, because now this being that has all these abstract kind of attributes, like immateriality, suddenly is looking at us. Yeah, we're in its attention, we'll say it's for now. It gets uncomfortable. This week we're going to be talking about something that gets even more uncomfortable, which is this being that's paying attention to us does care about how we live our lives and has something to say about how we live our lives. And so this is why it gets, this is where the conversation could start to go awry, because you get into who are you to push your morality on me and things like that. So we're going to try and put this argument together in a way that doesn't get into us waving our finger at people, you don't live your life right, and we get seen as only protesters, which we, of course we protest sin and evil, and we post our things that we post on Facebook, saying when things are immoral, we do. But that's not the same thing as the moral argument. That's us being salt and light and trying to affect change, so that we get involved in moral issues culturally, because when immorality reigns, humans suffer, right? Babies suffer, old people suffer, women suffer, marriages suffer. We don't. That's why we get involved, because we love people and we care, and we're saying, don't do these things because either you or your loved ones are going to have a worse life because of it. We don't want that. And then, of course, sometimes we'll have a worse life because of it. But the moral argument is something other than that. It comes first, actually. So if objective morals and values exist, then God exists. Now, that doesn't necessarily seem as obvious as if the universe has a beginning, the universe has a cause. That's kind of obvious. So this one takes a little bit more unpacking. Objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. So that's what we're going to deal with today. If you remember, because it was here in North Carolina, what is it about North Carolina? The bathroom bill and so many, why are we like the center of all these cultural things? Like, I left Michigan to come to a place with a little bit more sanity, and now it followed me here. I didn't bring it, I swear. But do you remember a few years ago, there were signs just outside of Charlotte, I think it was on the way to where the lights, the Christmas lights, the McAdenville, going that direction out of town. I remember that one of the billboards were there. This is a billboard, I'm sorry, a sign that was in the metro. This is a bus. I can't remember what city. I think it was D.C., Washington, D.C. But the Freedom From Religion Foundation, heard of them? Maybe they've been active. They're usually the ones that you hear about in the news, because they want religion out completely from the public square. So they're made up of a bunch of lawyers, so you'll see a lot of cases. The movie God's Not Dead, they're usually on the other side of, see, ACLU and these guys. So they bought, and they continue to do it, but not as much anymore. Every Christmas they would buy Just Be Good for Goodness Sake, a play on the words of the Here Comes Santa Claus. It's watching you, so be good for goodness sake. Why believe in a God? Just be good for goodness sake. What would you say to that?
Why?
It's always a good thing to do, just keep asking why. Or the way Kokel says, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by good?
Define good, yeah.
Yeah. That's always a good thing to ask. Can we be good without God is the question. So think about that statement, because it's a good way to start the conversation. Just ask them. So say this comes up, just be good for goodness sake, or why believe in God? Just ask the question, well, do you think that we can be good without God? And then listen to what we're about to talk about, and we'll come back around to that question later. Okay, so when we say, can we be good without God? We're not asking a question, can a person be good if they don't believe in God? So the question is actually, can we be good without God? Well, at this point, just any God. Some transcendent being that has a moral demand on our lives. Can we be good without God? Well, what we're actually asking is, can we be good without God existing? It sounds like when we ask it, can we be good if we don't believe in God? And you're purposely letting them down that path a little bit to start thinking about what you mean by good. Like you said, that's the $1,000,000 question here. So if there's no such thing as good, then there's no such thing as evil. There's just brute facts, right? It is what it is. So this isn't, well, just if you're squeamish, what we're saying is if there's no such thing as good, if there's no such thing as evil, then that, the Holocaust, was a morally neutral act. There's nothing wrong with that. 9/11, nothing wrong with one religion living out faithfully. The Nazis were sincere, faithful, well thought out with their eugenics program. The 9/11 jihadists were living out what a large number of Muslims think is the most pure form of their religion. It's not every Muslim, it's not even the majority of them, but many, many, many Muslims do think that is what the Quran and the Hadith are talking about. If you remember the Boston bomber, Boston Marathon, those guys, again, they were motivated by Islam, but same thing. And then I don't remember where it was, but the concert out west, I think it was in Vegas. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Which concert? It was a country concert?
Yeah.
And the guy, yeah, so you remember that? That was more recent. None of these things, and you could come up with all sorts of things, right? None of these things can be called evil if there isn't a God. Because if there is no such thing as objective moral values, remember the argument we said, if objective morals and values exist, then God exists? So start with, well, do objective morals and values exist at all? Let's just talk about that. Do you think this was objectively wrong? And what do we mean by objective as opposed to subjective with morals? If something's objective,
Absolute.
right, it's not personal, which would be subjective. So to say that purple is the best color, well, that's subjective. It depends on who's asking. To say, there's an elephant in the room right now, or there's an elephant, in the room right now, that's objective. It can't be true for me, but not for you, because that's a statement of objective reality. It's false, objectively. That's what we mean about morals. When we say that these things were evil and wrong, that means it was evil and wrong for the Muslims that did it. It was evil and wrong for the Nazis that did it. Because their morality, a good way of looking at it is this way. Say the Nazis won, and if you do watch some of these documentaries on Netflix and other stuff, they were close to winning. I mean, it's scary to think because they were extraordinarily intelligent. Remember, they had almost 100% literacy rate in Germany, which is why we say public education is not the solution to society's problems, because there was no better educated society than Nazi Germany, and they did that. The people who were piling up these bodies were doctors and lawyers and engineers and people with degrees from major institutions. So that's just a little side note, but let's say they pull it off and they did conquer the whole globe. So everybody that was left, either the show Man in the High Castle. Yeah. I got through 2 seasons. And I don't know why I haven't gotten to season 3 yet. You know what that is? Man in the High Castle. It's an Amazon original, and it's one of those what if stories. And what if the Nazis had won? What if it was the Nazis that figured out how to split the atom first and developed the atomic bomb? And they bombed, I think it was New York, was it, that they bombed? Something or San Francisco, I can't remember, they bombed something, and so our nation is split. The West is, Japan runs the West, and Germany runs the East, and it's what our life would be like now if they had won. So it's really an interesting story, but what if that had happened? And everybody left on planet Earth either now believes Nazi propaganda or was killed. So the only people left are Nazis. When we say it's objectively wrong to murder Jews for ethnic cleansing, we're saying it doesn't matter if every single person on the planet would vote yes to that. Every single person on the planet is wrong, is what we would say. That's an important distinction. because we often will say, well, every culture has their own, who are we to say we drive on this side of the road, whereas in England they drive on the other side of the road. It's the same thing. And we talk about Puritan values of faithfulness and things like that, but that's just us just pushing our will on others. It's not wrong for Middle East to treat women the way they do and to have, however many wives, you can't remember if there's a limit even. You see, they start bringing driving on what side of the road or chopsticks versus utensils to be on par with treatment of each other and what to do, what right people have to do things to and with other human beings. So what we mean, this is something I want to diverge a little bit from the book to give you a little bit more understanding and a deeper ponder this. By what standard do we measure Hitler and Mother Teresa? They're the two punching bags on both sides. So nobody wants to call Mother Teresa a bad moral person, and nobody wants to stand up for Hitler. And so it's just a good sample, but you can pick whatever you want. For if you're witnessing to a liberal, put this would be Trump and this would be Bernie Sanders, in their view. So by by what standard do we measure when we say Hitler was a bad person and Mother Teresa was a good person? That's the question we're asking. So, what is the measuring stick? You hear people say that God is the standard of morality? You hear Christians talk like that? I've used that because I know what people mean by it, but a few years ago, one of our professors started harping on this in class, and the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, yeah, you're right. What would be wrong with saying God's nature is God is the standard for morality?
God what?
Is the standard for morality. He is the ultimate standard.
We're not God.
Well, yeah, you can't be God.
Can't stand.
Not
Would never
even
be
Adam and
able to do
Eve.
We can't divide up 5 fish or 5 loaves of bread and feed them.
God never calls humans to be him. In fact, he is hard on people when they start thinking that they're think about Job finally railing against God, and what's God answer with? Excuse me? Were you there when I created all you put him in his place? There's only one God and you ain't me. So what is then the standard by which all humans are measured? Perfect human nature. See, this is getting back to every argument for God's existence, when you really think through it, is a cosmological argument. Remember, cosmological, all that means, there's a whole bunch of arguments that are called cosmological. It just means that you're looking at what's in creation and reasoning to there's a God. And so normally we do the Big Bang and the beginning of the universe because that's easiest and most accessible. But anytime you're reasoning from even, okay, well, why do you think there's something rather than nothing? Why do you think, remember the example of the noise? There was a symphony being played out in the hall, and we wouldn't say what was the cause, some past tense, of that symphony. We would say, what's the cause right now? Existence, the fact that anything exists, needs an explanation. Is it exist in itself because it is existence? The explanation is itself, or does it get its existence from something else? There's only two options. Well, we know that we're not self-existent because we came into existence, right? I know I haven't lived forever. I can't be the cause of my own existence. It doesn't do any good to say my mom is the cause of my existence because that just chases it, further in the past. At some point, there has to be something that is existence. So that philosophical argument, which doesn't rely on the universe, could be eternal even, and it would still, because it's finite, needs to have its existence explained by something else. That's a philosophical argument. That's a cosmological. So fast forward to the moral argument here. Human nature is a thing. It exists. It's a part of creation. We all have human nature, right? We have, how do we say it? I'm trying not to be super philosophical. The philosophical word is, the form is humanness or humanity. And each of us are an instance of that. That's what binds us all together. That's why the original sin could be passed down to all humanity, because it was human nature that was now cursed. Not changed, but cursed. And then the fact that Jesus' death, what does Jesus' death have to do with us? Because he had 100% human nature. He was full. That's why the doctrine of the incarnation is so important. He had to be fully human and then also fully God in order for him to have anything to do with us. So there's this thing, think of it as a separate thing for right now. It's a little sloppy philosophically, but it helps. There's this thing called human nature. It needs an explanation for its existence as well. Just like anything, a rock needs an explanation for existence. Anything physical, but human nature needs an explanation as well. That thing that we call human nature is, what we mean by that is perfect human nature. To be a perfect human is what we're talking about when we say there's human nature. That's why we say that, and so human nature would be the measuring stick. Hitler, you were bad at being a human. Mother Teresa, you were good at being a human. Not perfect, but we would say, what does it mean to be a human? Love people, care for their needs, things like that. And yeah, you hit the mark on those things. Hitler, you, instead of loving people, you tried exterminating people. That's bad. Bad boy.
We judge that by Jesus.
Interesting, isn't it, that yes, Jesus lived a perfect human life in his humanity. It wasn't his godliness, his divine nature that we are called to measure up to. He was the perfect human in his human nature. Meditating on who Jesus is and the Trinity will blow your mind, because we're talking about God becoming man, and it's crazy to think about, crazy in a good way. We can talk more about the Trinity. That we do that when we do the doctrines class. Do you guys remember those? You were, I think, in that one we talked about. Do you remember? Al can fill you in right now. He remembers all that. But it's cool to think about, even if it's confusing. But you would expect your eyes to cross more and more as you get closer to talking about the infinite, eternal God. And so and the best thing we can do is to not say wrong things. So we say Jesus was 50% human and 50% God. We know that's wrong. That's a heresy. Partialism it's called. He is 100% human, 100% God. What do we mean by that? I don't entirely know how to say what that is. We know that there's only one God, but three persons. There's one existence, three essences. We say it in ways that help us to not say heresies that go into a cult or another religion. So it helps us still, but we're finite. We're never going to understand what it means to exist in three persons and three centers of consciousness, but still only be one being. That's not part of our experience. We can't, even schizophrenics can't really understand what that means. So philosophy a lot of times just helps us from making big mistakes. And this gets into when we talk about God in our worship songs or our artistic expressions. We have to be careful, because sometimes being artsy-fartsy gets too close to the fartsy, and you're saying things about God that are heresies. God is everywhere. We don't invite him to come into our church every Sunday, but we sing like that sometimes. Think about what it is we mean when we say that. That's just one easy example, because we all know the songs that talk about we invite you in this place, we want to see your face. He doesn't have a face. He's not a physical thing. He is not thankful that we invited him here. Okay, my omnipresent nature is now welcome to be in your church. Of course, we don't mean that. So thinking about God, about what the boundaries are, will help us, I think, in our prayer and our worship as well. So that's a little diversion, but it's important. Human nature. Okay, perfect human nature is this thing. It doesn't mean that every person has to look and sound and you had your hand up.
No, yeah, I just was gonna talk about the Mother Teresa and Hitler. Because if you had put like Stalin up there, then of course, in real life, what's going on politically right now is James O'Keefe had exposed Bernie employees and what they were talking about.
I didn't see that part.
Oh yeah,
I know he vacationed in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but he's got their voice saying on tape, saying talking about how when Bernie wins, they're going to start getting the re-edu camps, this is people that are working for re-education camps together, that the ones
like the
in the
Bolsheviks.
gulags were not bad. They were great places to go. They treated the people very well there, and they were just educating them. But these guys were just, I mean.
Rewriting history.
Yeah, they're moral relativists, because they think it's okay, and, yeah.
Yeah, if you're an
They don't-
atheist,
they don't-
you'd have
they
to be
would
more
not-
relativist.
They would actually probably would say, okay, Stalin's good, Mother Teresa was bad because she wasn't.
If you remember when we did the Communist Manifesto last summer or the summer
Yeah.
before, yeah, the biggest problem with that book is the first page it says there is no God, and therefore if there's no God, then there's no human nature, which means no one's measured against anything. Well, if that's the case, then what's wrong with the rich oppressing the poor? Who cares? It's just, I mean, we see it in human.
Trying to be the rich.
Right. Well, or not. If you're just molecules, it's all your consciousness is even an illusion. Good and bad is an illusion. Suffering and enjoyment are illusions. It's just you're just molecules. What's the big deal? It's inconsistent. And so communism, right at the core, has this contradiction. There is no God, therefore no morals, but it's immoral for the rich to oppress the poor.
And I had another question. This one, the schizophrenia, that'd be modalism, wouldn't it?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah. That'd be that, okay.
Yeah, a modalism in the Trinity.
Yeah.
I was talking about Jesus didn't have two different centers of consciousness either, like his divine consciousness.
Yeah.
He has one center of consciousness. There's one person, but there's two natures. What does that mean? I don't know. But again, I'm not God. Ask my kids and my wife. That's painfully clear that I'm not. So I can't tell you what it's like to be hypostatically united between your divine and your human nature. Well, we can ask Jesus and see what he says. So how are we measured? Okay. Now, this thing called human nature is another reason I like talking about this is most Americans, at least 50% of us right now, after watching last night and seeing the reaction, too few Americans are aware of our founding principles. So this is something that's good for us to talk about, even just to help our country and our culture to improve. Start talking about human nature. Start talking about objective morals more often. You don't even have to be going for the gospel every time. It's important. And our founding fathers, interestingly, just a little diversion, but this is an application of what we're talking about. They did not quote any scripture verses in the Declaration or in the Constitution. They didn't name Yahweh. They didn't name Jesus. They talked about God. They talked about, but why did they not do that? Because the majority of them were Christians, right? Congregationalists and a couple Unitarians in there, but for the most part they were Christians. Many of them were pastors. So why didn't they, people who love the Lord, feel the need to talk about God and Jesus as they're founding our country? Because not everybody does believe in God and Jesus. And they knew that they were going to have to govern everybody in this new country. So if you're going to govern everybody, well, what's the lowest common denominator that can be true of everybody? It's human nature. It doesn't matter what your religion is. It doesn't matter if you have no religion. You are a human, which means you have rights. And what they're saying is endowed by your Creator. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So created right away, you have a God. But they didn't quote Genesis 1. They could have easily, right? That they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Inalienable means even government, and they go on in the Declaration to talk about this, doesn't have the right to strip these of you. It's not even in their power, even in principle, they cannot take your rights away from you. They're unalienable. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So,
Did you believe in a creator?
yes, they were theists or deists. But even, why is it that Benjamin Franklin, who called himself an atheist, Hobbes, same thing, there were atheists in our founding fathers who signed on to this, which is really odd to me. Like, if you're an atheist, how would you be okay with this? Thomas Jefferson, he wasn't really an atheist. He was not a Christian. You guys know his story about his Bible. He actually took a pair of scissors and physically cut out everything that was a miracle in his Bible, the famous Jefferson Bible. Because that four-step approach we have, truth, we put in there miracles are possible because there are people like him who say, I believe in God, I believe in all these things, but I don't think he can act in this world. So they're more of a deist than and a theist. That's the difference between deism and theism. But the point, I think, is they knew they had to govern people who were not going to believe the Bible. So they couldn't quote the Bible, but they still wanted to point out reality, which is you who don't, Romans 2 says this, even people, the pagans who had never read Moses' 10 Commandments, knew by nature that murder was wrong, lying is wrong. Paul asked the question, why is it that you Gentiles do by nature what the law demands? It's because that's how God made us. We know as humans. Even humans who are going to spend eternity in hell. And this gets back to the 3 different ways of doing apologetics I mentioned at the beginning. One of those ways, so evidentialism, where we start with the resurrection, is I think they just get it out of order. You don't start with the resurrection, you start with truth, and then theism, and then you get to miracles, and then you prove the resurrection. Because of what we said, people can come up with weird scientific explanations. But I still think evidentialism is good. Like I would recommend read Josh McDowell, who's an evidentialist, Gary Habermas, who's an evidentialist. All day long I would recommend reading those people. But presuppositionalism is another, third category of doing apologetics. They deny this, that if a person is not saved, they don't know. There's something in their minds, it's called epistemic. There's something wrong with their thinking, that they literally don't know there's a God. So they're dead spiritually. You've heard that phrase. I come from a Lutheran and Presbyterian background, so I was raised this way, talking about the unsaved, that they're dead spiritually. I was told that you can't witness to non-believers really because you're literally talking to a corpse, they would say. That's how I was taught. So you share the gospel and you stare at them and see if God raised them from the dead. And once he did, they can understand the gospel, but it doesn't matter because they're already saved. It was the weirdest thing. And then once I learned a little bit more, I was like, oh, that's why I never believed that. It just sounds crazy. So presuppositionalists will deny this natural law, or this natural law meaning that if you're a human with human nature, you know certain things. Romans 1 says, through creation, people see God and his attributes. Romans 2 says this, that they know what's right and wrong. Even people who don't have the law, they know what's right and wrong. Because you go to any culture, you see a basic morality that plays itself out in their rules and laws. That's why our country's founding is so important to get that right. We're not a Christian nation. It's not to say we're immoral or we don't believe in God. I'm actually elevating Christianity by saying this. What I'm saying is reality makes Christianity so obvious that anybody who's thinking correctly is going to admit that it's true. Doesn't mean they'll accept Christ necessarily, but they'll admit it's true. But they didn't found a Christian nation on purpose. And then presuppositionalism, just be aware of that phrase. If you hear people say things like, God's word versus man's word, that's one way of saying it. That gets into this whole problem with unbelievers. They can understand what you're saying. Otherwise, Romans 1 and 2 are wrong. What Psalm 95 is it, or 104? The heavens declare the glory of God. It's interesting. It says the heavens declare. So declaration is speaking, right? It's giving content. It's not some artsy kind of, I don't know anything about this God, but I just have this feeling inside of me. It says it declares all day long. The Psalm says it pours forth speech. Like, there's a lot that people can know just by looking at creation. And when you do science, then you're really in trouble if you're an unbeliever, because now you're really understanding the depth of God's design and his causality and all that. So that's not a side thing, because that's a big thing of this class, is we as Baptists, and especially First Baptist Indian Trail, and the vast majority of evangelical and Catholic, to be honest, Christians all agree with this approach. It's this large but minority group within Christian apologetics called presuppositionalists that try to change this. And if you ever run across it and you want to talk more about it, because it's a really in-depth conversation, it could be, I'd love to, but it's not the purpose of the talk today. But just be aware of it. Right away whenever you hear a word like that, or say, hey, let's talk to Eric or one of our professors or something. Because there are people who unwittingly will say things and they'll buy into it because it's alluring. Okay, so rewind. Our founding fathers said natural law, not the Bible, but natural law, human nature. That's what I love about the civil rights movement when it started the right way after Malcolm X. So you know the story. Martin Luther King Jr. did a lot of things to break the law. He rode on buses. He encouraged his followers to ride on buses. He drank in drinking fountains that were labeled white only. The law said he was not allowed to do it. It was a crime to do the things that he was doing, and he was encouraging all the people to do in his congregation, in his movement. He, remember, was a Baptist minister. So one of the times he got locked up in Birmingham, Alabama, he decided to write down on a scrap piece of newspaper. That's how brilliant this guy was, and how much he thought about this concept, that he could, from memory, write all this stuff out. So this is a quote. Now, he's saying, okay, it starts off earlier where he says, okay, I'm breaking the law, I'm in jail. And I'm with people that were protesting with me. They're in jail. And I'm encouraging them to do it again, go to jail. But I'm a Christian, I'm a Baptist minister. Where do I get off encouraging people to break the law? That's a very good question, fellow ministers. So the audience for this was to other Baptist ministers, so he could explain himself. So first of all, he's deep, well educated, but also think how upstanding that is. Hey, it's legitimate for you to hold me accountable. I can't just go and do whatever I want without being accountable to the body of Christ. So there's a humility there. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't perfect. You guys probably heard about his extramarital affair and things like that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that he did civil rights the right way. Because he said, okay, that's a good question. Why am I telling people to break the law? Well, let's go back and read our Declaration of Independence. So what is the difference between a just and an unjust law? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God, natural law. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. And this is where I get excited because he quotes Aquinas. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Man, if more people would be reading Aquinas and thinking about these things today in the civil debates that we have, and we just talked in these terms, I think a lot of what we saw last night just would go away. We would still argue about this or that policy, but I mean, it was ridiculous, wasn't it? Like children. I'm allowed to say that in church. I'm not advocating for a candidate. You guys can't vote for Pelosi anyway. None of us can. We're not in her district. It's crazy. It is. I dare them to take their platform and say why I should believe all those things based on natural law. Because natural law will not give you that the environment's more important than humans. Natural law gives you humans are the most important thing in all of creation. It gives you stewardship. And why do we not destroy the earth? Because the humans are that important that we want to take care of it for future generations and for our neighbor, for example. I don't take my garbage and throw it over my fence, out of sight, out of mind, because that's not loving my neighbor as myself. So we have good reasons to behave ourselves, and we can maybe agree with some things with them, but not because we're sinning against Mother Earth. There is no Mother Earth. So this is the beauty of what he said. I'm doing the same thing that our founding fathers were doing. Now, if you think I'm doing something wrong by breaking the law and telling people to break the law, then you disagree with our founding fathers, in which case our whole country is illegitimate. We should all go back and join the crown. Go back to England, say we're sorry, didn't mean it, we're your subjects again. So he had them. It was brilliant, because he just read what the founding fathers wrote. Many of them said, we know slavery's wrong. We just can't get this passed if we outlaw it right now. And so there was this debate about how soon do you do it? And the famous quote from Amistad was, they knew it, the abolitionists or the people who were against slavery, and they said, okay, we're going to write this Constitution and this Declaration in such a way that slavery is absolutely impossible to continue with. It's going to be so uncomfortable that eventually it's going to cause either a change or a split or a war. We know that, and we're doing that on purpose. But we can't win that right now and still have a nation, so we're going to bake in all the tools necessary to do that later on. They did that, and some of them said that explicitly. So he's taking this moral law and putting it up there saying, now, again, you notice he's not quoting, why am I not breaking the law? He didn't quote Romans 13 and say, Romans 13 tells me to obey the governing authorities, but now I'm not. Why should I? He's talking about philosophy. He's talking about the moral law. Okay. We're not saying, this is where I think we're misheard, because we don't think Christians ever say this, but sometimes we do. We're not saying that atheists cannot be moral people. There are really people who don't believe in God that are really good people. We would say, all right, there's this thing called human nature, and you, through your own works, are doing better than this person over here. You're better than and less than language does make sense when we're talking about non-believers. Now, it doesn't matter how better than you are, you're going to hell if you don't have Jesus paying the price, because the standard is perfection, perfect human life. None of us make it. Jesus did. He's the only out we have. So you talk about the gospel as you're trying to clarify for somebody, hey, we don't think atheists are immoral people. We're not saying that they don't know right and wrong. They do know right and wrong. Not perfectly, right? They get it wrong many, many times. We are saying, though, that atheists cannot justify morality. They can theorize about how we know murder is wrong, but atheism doesn't give you any objective standard that it says why murder is wrong. So do you think the lion chasing down the gimpest of the gazelles, think about this in the animal kingdom, not only do animals kill each other, but it's the handicapped and the elderly that get off first, because they can't run as fast as the young and the fit. And the young and the fit are like, see you, Grandma, you know, they're out of there. And so the lion gets the slowest one. So, atheists, that's what nature shows us. Why is it then wrong for somebody to off their grandma because grandma's holding them back? Because I hope you think that's wrong, right? Let's clarify that first, because if you don't, I'm going to make another phone call when I leave this room here. Most people will say, yeah, of course it's wrong. But why is the question? There has to be an immaterial objective standard in order for you to call anything wrong. Even if you're incorrect about what you're labeling wrong, the accusation that littering is wrong, or today, it is immoral or wrong for you to say that gay people cannot get married. It is immoral or wrong for you to say that gender is fixed. That's immoral. That's what we're being told, right? How dare you be such a bigot as to say birth gender is fixed throughout your life? That is hateful and so on and so forth. Okay, well, I fully disagree with you. But if it's wrong for me, because I could just say, well, it's okay for me, that's right for you, wrong for me, or vice versa, because it's all subjective. No, it's objectively wrong, and I'm going to punish you with the law if you don't fall in line. Okay, well, if it's objectively wrong, then God exists. Because there's this thing then called perfect human nature, and in that thing called perfect human nature, somewhere in the list of things that's true about it is gender is fluid, it can be whatever you want. Okay, well, show me why that's the case, that human nature can be either this or that. There's no scientific or philosophical argument that holds up there. So pick something that they actually care about, a hot button topic for an atheist or a liberal activist, let's say. Say, well, if you write that Trump is that evil, then you believe God exists. It's what they have to admit. So sometimes it's good just to, I don't say mess with them, but to put that pebble in their sandal, so next time they're all angry at Trump and the conservatives and whoever else they're angry at, they have that little, wait a second, am I saying God exists when I get mad at him? I don't want to, and they'll push it aside until God brings someone else in their life to pull something else out. So it's good pre-evangelism. So we agree with atheists that sometimes you can point to atheists who live a better life than some Christians. Some people who say they're church people, I like to say that because that doesn't mean they're born again, right? But church people have poisoned the teachings of Christ. People point to things like the Spanish Inquisition, forced baptisms, right? Baptize or we're going to kill you. Well, that's what Jesus said, right? Go out and do that. What do you call it? The Crusades. although they misrepresent what the Crusades even were, but they'll say the Crusades were evil. Oh, so you believe in God? That's great. No, I don't. You just said you did. Or, homophobia is wrong. Oh, you believe in God too. Awesome. High five. We're both theists. Because it has to be the case. And they can see that. But we are saying that there's no moral or immoral. There's no such thing as those two concepts, just or unjust, good or evil, whatever label you want to give it, unless God exists, because of all the things that we just said. Now, if you read the atheist books, it's comical and sad. So I read this book I had to for class, and it's called God, the Failed Hypothesis. There's a new atheist who's dead now, but he was still alive at the time. And I read the chapter. I had to do a paper on the chapter on morality. And the first page, he states the argument I already put up there, that if morals are objective and they exist and God exists and all that. And he says, this is the argument, and what do we do with that? And then the next 10 pages were nothing but testimonies. One would be a little section of a person who believes in God doing something awful, like killing his family, or nun abusing the children, or whatever. Just these really horrible stories of people who say they believe in God doing awful things. And then another story of an atheist doing really ethical things, and maybe an atheist like, or a non-believer like Schindler, Oskar Schindler, who saved all those Jews. So he would tell stories like that. So the whole chapter was nothing but, here's a Christian being bad, here's an atheist being good, Christian bad. But that wasn't the argument that he stated on the first page. And so I thought, okay, this guy is just a sloppy thinker. Then I came across a debate that he did with Bill Craig, William Lane Craig, a couple of years prior to him writing this book. And in that debate, they did this argument about morality. You have to have God if you have morality. And they started doing their back and forth section. And Bill came up and he said, Bill Craig, the Christian, said, okay, you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. I'm not saying you have to believe in God to be moral, all the things that I'm putting up here now. He said, I'm only saying that there's no objective right or wrong unless there's a God. And this guy who, in this book, mischaracterizes the moral argument, he was the one debating Bill Craig before he wrote the book. He said in the microphone, okay, I understand what you're saying, Bill, that you are not saying that only people who believe in God can act morally, but you're just saying that God has to exist in order for something to be called good or evil. I get that. And then in his book, he completely rejects that and just goes with the popular bumper sticker kind of stuff. Show images of Christians behaving badly that motivate people to not be Christians. It's the emotional argument. So that's where I lost respect for. I already didn't respect the new atheists very much, but when you have somebody who you know for a fact they understand your argument that you're making, and then they mischaracterize it on purpose because they know it's easier to get the reader to be on your side if you mischaracterize something, that's bad scholarship. I mean, you won't get an A on a paper in a state university if you turn in that kind of thinking. And yet they sell 100 million books, like The God Delusion. Any questions yet?
That's why Christians should really also know what they're talking about whenever they talk about this stuff.
Yep.
And know that and be careful not to put up strong men arguments as well.
That's what I'm hoping that this class helps, is every single one of us, because we've inherited it largely, it's almost never intentional or what's the word, devious, when Christians go out and they say things that are wrong. You see that meme that came around a couple weeks ago? I can do all things through verse taken out of context. Do you see that? I love that. I liked it and loved it every time I saw it. It's hilarious because that verse is being taken out of context. Like, hey, sports teams, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. You think that's what Paul was talking about? No. And then this other one, and I see it all the time, but if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, I will hear them and I will heal their land. And we see that all the time with the American flag behind it, don't we? Read that passage. That passage is, Israel, you're about to go into the promised land. This is Joshua. Okay, this is my last lecture to you. I'm going to give you all this great stuff, and you're going to have crops growing, and I'm going to bless your land. Specifically meaning you're going to eat food if you keep obeying my commands. Now, if you don't, I will bring a famine But if you, my people, come back to me, I will heal your land, your crops will grow again. What does that have to do with the United States of America being a good moral nation? Nothing. The principle of being a good moral country and everything is in the Bible, but that's not the verse to go to. That's one of those things where I used to use that all the time. If my people, this is the passage you go to say we're supposed to be praying for spiritual revival. That's a stretch. It does not mean what we normally talk about it meaning. So we as Christians do this all the time, and that's like you said, we get misheard, but sometimes we actually misspeak, and we take verses out of context or concepts out of context.
Or we don't know that we should have taken it.
Exactly, and that's where just learning more is helpful. That said before, I don't think it's any kind of intentional mislead. Certainly, I don't think. Maybe I met a few, but Christians aren't trying to mislead people into the gospel, right? Lie to get them to be saved. That wouldn't make any sense. So that's not the problem that, by and large, we have in the church. Anti-intellectualism, or not just not learning these things, going back and reading 1 Chronicles 7:14, look at the context. Is this really what he's talking about, healing the land? That takes work that we're not doing. So there's a laziness. But then there's this I don't know what to call it, outrage might be too strong of a word, but you hear people say to those of us in the church that are concerned about these things, and we say, we should go back and read the original context. Well, you're just overthinking things. How come you get shot down often when you're just saying, no, let's make sure we're saying things that God said. Don't misrepresent God. There's nothing holy and pious about lying. And once we know it, so the problem with everybody here now is that now we all know this. And so if you go out and use those verses out of context now, right, so God holds us accountable for what we know. Maybe that's one reason people don't like to learn as much, is because then God's going to hold you accountable. It is pressure sometimes. And God is not up there with his thumb, because he doesn't have a thumb, he's spirit, but metaphorically with his thumb getting ready to squash you every time you mishandle the scripture. He lets us grow. He lets us make mistakes. I'm embarrassed by certain things that I used to teach 10 years ago. Looking back, oh Lord, please let them forget everything I said in that class. Because of growth. And so, yeah. So, can we be good without God? Yes, people can be good without believing in God. No, nobody can be called good if God doesn't exist. Nobody could be called evil if God doesn't exist. And so, Mr. Unbeliever, if you think that Christians are evil for taking away the rights of the gay community, the transgender community, if you're calling that evil, then you're agreeing with me that there's a God. We disagree maybe about what that God has said, but you are a theist. Welcome to the family, even though you're a distant relative. Mm-hmm. So, it's important. Okay. One of their objections is, well, evil does exist. This is teasing us for the one we're going to do in a couple weeks. Evil does exist, right? God is the author of everything. Evil is something, therefore God is the author of evil. You ever seen that? Anywhere ever thrown that up in your face, or you read it anywhere? This is a very common argument for the other side. This is them trying to make a case using syllogisms of why we're wrong to believe in God.
I know a preacher who
said that
says this.
God created evil?
Yeah.
Well, some hyper-Calvinists will concede that God is the author of evil because they believe that he is directly responsible for absolutely everything because he's so sovereign. So every act is not free, including rape and murder. And so they do say, yeah, he's sovereign. This
was a King James onlyer who was going by the verse that says God caused evil, whatever he was talking about, when the translation is actually chaos.
That's why original languages do matter.
Yeah.
You can get a lot out of an English translation. You can get everything you need to know to go to heaven and to grow in your faith. But when it comes to, well, this belief, like God created evil, is outside of orthodoxy. that's when you have to go back and, you don't necessarily learn Greek yourself or Hebrew yourself, but you better go read people who do. And again, it's study. So how would you respond to this?
You have to respond by defining what evil is.
Exactly. So what is evil?
Lack of good.
Privation.
Privation. Right. You guys read ahead.
No, privation.
Privation is the word, but lack of. What do we mean by privation? Okay. The creature on the left is a mole. Moles don't have eyes. Would you say that the mole is blind? The human, the creature, the person on the right is a human, and he has no sight. We call him blind. Even if you're going to say moles are blind, do you mean the same thing as when you say that that man is blind? Hope not. Why?
He has a bad eye.
Which
His
getting
eyes
back,
are- Right.
The nature. To be a full, complete human is not just a moral statement we're making. There are physical things that mean human nature. There are spiritual things. There are moral, ethical, there are psychological things. There are a lot of things you can say about what it means to be human. And that just means that everybody has it. Being human doesn't mean being male, because then women wouldn't be the same species and vice versa. So you can't say being male is what it means to be human. It doesn't mean transgenderism. That's a whole other argument later. But so privation, like you said, is what evil is. So the best way to say it is this guy on the right lacks something he ought to have. The animal on the left shouldn't have it. Rocks aren't blind. Rocks don't have the inability to sing, and that's like they're dumb. It's that they're not supposed to sing. So you see the difference there. A good way of saying, and this is great analogy because the Bible uses light and darkness as a metaphor all the time. Light is a thing, but what is shadow? There isn't anything called really darkness. It's what we mean by that is so the shadow of my hand, if we had a spotlight over this a table, is just my hand is stopping the light from hitting that part of the table. So that part of the table lacks the light, whereas that part has the light. But the shadow isn't a thing. Photons are actual things called light. So it's the same thing with evil. What that means is God created this thing called perfect human nature, which includes free will, part of what it means to have human nature. And in order to have free will, you have to have the choice to not do the good. So the possibility of sin and evil had to be there in order for there to be love. So humans, when we say that's an evil act, what we're saying is that lacks all good. There's a thing that you're supposed to do, a way you're supposed to treat another human being, you lack that. We call that evil. We say that in the positive sense, like that is evil. We're not saying that is not good, or that's not good. We just say that's evil. So it has meaning, but you see, it's not a thing. So if it's not a thing, God created everything good. We put privations in things that ought to be. That made all the sense in the world to me when I first came across that, because it takes away God from being the author of evil. And that's another reason why I get a little bit more passionate about certain types of Christianity that are Christians. They're going to heaven. There's nothing. They're not fringe Christians. It's just the hyper-Calvinist tradition is one that I have a hard time with. And this is one of the reasons. Because to be consistent, and many of them they put it in writing, so they're consistent. Yes, God is the author of evil. He's that sovereign. Yeah, or sin, they'll say. He's the cause, the direct cause of that murder or that rape or that.
Was laughing at you said he's that sovereign. It's just like there's a degree.
That's a whole other class. We should do that one time. Predestination versus free will. Oh man. Yeah. Well, I know Pastor and I think the same way on this one, so I would not be in trouble on that one, because that he and I both are concerned about hyper Calvinism, how it plays out in churches. So anyway, so another thing, God's not created evil because of the privation, but we have evil in the world. Okay, we'll all admit that. We at least know that God allows evil because it's here. He could, because God miraculously healed blindness, he miraculously healed sickness and even death a few times. So we know he can, but he still doesn't. So he's not completely off the hook, so to speak. I'm not saying that God is on trial here, but he's not off the hook entirely because things still happen. It's helpful to say there are two kinds of evil when we say evil. The first one would be natural evil. And what you have here is a hurricane. That's Dorothy's house. Actually, no, because it's torn apart. Hers stayed together. Natural evil would be hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, things like that. Nobody sinned to cause a tornado. Oh, it's almost true. Because people could say, like, human activity, global warming, things like that. Theoretically, it's possible.
Butterfly effect, man.
What?
Butterfly effect.
Butterfly
There,
effect, man.
yeah. Maybe it is. But let's just grant that and say, okay, God is the direct author of, or at least he allowed the earthquake to happen.
But if Adam had sinned,
That's what theologically would say that. But then why didn't God just snatch up Adam and Eve right then and give them resurrection bodies, or come down and die for them right away? He still allowed thousands of years of human existence, which includes suffering, and it includes love and joy and all that too. There's nothing about being a Christian that God, it's somewhat arbitrary, especially from our side of the equation. Why didn't God come quicker? Why isn't he coming now? I don't know. But I know that every person that gets born, that's that many more people that can be saved, which means there are that many more people who will be saved. But it also means that there are that many more people who are going to go to hell. So why does God allow us to continue to exist right now as a species, and keep having more and more people be born? We don't have to have an answer for that to defend Christianity. There's nothing inconsistent with God loves us, and he's allowing the human race to continue. We can say, hey, it's that many more people who are going to have the ultimate good living with him forever. But we have to also just accept that it means the majority of people are going to not live with him forever. So we don't have to have an answer for everything. The Christian belief system, Christian worldview, if you want to call that, I don't like that language, but Christian worldview isn't a neat bow tied on every single question to the point where there's nowhere else that we just walk around with all the answers, and if we don't have any, I don't know. Job, the one book that's all dedicated to why suffering. The interesting thing is the reader, us, we know that there's this wager made in heaven between God and Satan. The whole book, no one else is told that. All the way up to the end, and when Job says, I demand an answer, and he says, hey, were you there when I created? Are you God? No, I'm God. I'm sovereign. You don't get to ask why things happen. And Job repents, and he does the right thing. Says, you're right. You're God. I'm not going to take your blessings and refuse your I don't know if it says curses, but accept the good but not the bad. But think about this. Do we as readers know why God made that wager with Satan? We don't have an answer any more than, even though we know the circumstances in the throne room when Satan goes up and says, hey, Job down there, he'd curse you. And God says, all right, well, I'll let you try. We have no idea why God did that. So the one book in the Bible that deals with why there's suffering doesn't give us an airtight answer. It just says, the message of the book is, focus on God, who he is, that reminds you who you are, and then at least contextualizes it for you. And it does make it easier to go through suffering. I think all of us who've gone through major suffering, it doesn't hurt any less, but I've felt the ability, at least, to go through pain where I see others that may have crumpled under it or may drastically wrong choices or whatever. So that's an important thing to point out. And the other thing is natural evil. So let's say earthquakes. So we have an earthquake in Haiti, and tens of thousands of people die because buildings are collapsing. The houses that are just built up on a cliff just start sliding down. So the just damage, death is through the roof. And it's a 4 on the Richter scale. But in Los Angeles, a 6 on the Richter scale, and they barely stop traffic in the rush hour, which is 24 hours a day there. So what's the difference? The difference between Haiti and the United States in this case is that in the United States we have this belief that it's unethical for a construction company to take a bribe and build substandard, or for an inspector to take a bribe and say that that building is up to code when it's not. We don't follow it perfectly. We don't have to be utopia to make this point. But we in America have this belief that humans are the most valuable creatures, whether they, everyone admits it or they're all Christian or not. Everyone basically has that belief system. And so we do demand these codes and these standards. So the same earthquake, so my point is, something that looks like it's a natural evil and all these deaths happen in Haiti, let's say, there is a human element to it, a moral and ethical element to it, which gets it to the other kind of evil done. Look, why did those people fly? Because they were evil. They were misguided, they were evil. Now why did God not strike the planes down or cause the terrorists to choke that morning so they couldn't get into the airplanes? You can ask those questions, because he could have, right? But again, you don't have to have an answer. God doesn't owe us an answer. But he does invite us to ask questions that, at the end of which, we're focusing on him. And if that's the end of the process you go through, asking the questions about evil and suffering and why, but you're refocused on him, sometimes he will give an answer, but it seems like most of the time he doesn't tell us why. I'm not entirely convinced that we'll know in heaven. I know for sure we won't care. Because we'll be with God, we'll be like, I don't even remember that down there. But there is some memory of our life on earth here, it looks like. So I like to think that he's going to answer all these questions for us, but we don't know for sure. So that we're going to go into a lot more when we deal with the problem of evil and suffering. But again, you can pick any current event, pick up any newspaper, if people still know what those are. Click on any news site, how's that? And you'll find a story within 30 seconds that you can use as an example. Okay, that story right there, was that evil, what that person did, what these people are doing or whatever? And if the person says, yeah, I think that was wrong, I think it was immoral, unethical, evil, whatever word you want to use, then okay, you may not believe me yet, but you believe in God. Let's work on that together. Let's think that through together. So you can see how you don't have to have any science knowledge. That's what I said at the beginning. That's why I like this line of reasoning or this argument for God's existence, is that all of us can do this. Just don't make mistakes and misrepresent God and say things about God that are horrible, like
Pure
God. What that?
Pure evil.
Yeah,
It's
like
pure evil.
I think it is. Yeah, God's the cause of that sin or that murder. It's not a free act because there are no free acts. So God is the cause of that. Don't say that. And short of that, you'll be fine. Any questions, or do you agree with me that this sounds like a little bit more attractive of a argument than the other last 2 weeks we've done in science?
It's easier.
Because it's our everyday experience. Most of us aren't looking in telescopes and microscopes.
Chris
But
and
this,
I are scientists.
you are, so you like the other one.
We're both chemists.
You're going to have to go back and listen to those talks then. Last week, you were here for the design argument, so you probably got some on that. You understood that levels that I don't. So do you, there are some good ministries out there that you haven't partooken of that you want to look at, because there's one in particular I'll tell you after class. They are scouring the scientific literature in all the fields, physics, astronomy, chemistry, biology, and they look for papers, the peer-reviewed papers, and they'll say, okay, see this study right here? That demonstrates, and I'll show you why that proves that God exists. It's really cool. good ministry, right?
Seems like there's more and more and more. Or maybe we're just being made aware of.
Well, there is a revival of apologetics and sound thinking going on in the church, and I'm so excited about that, because we used to have to explain, okay, I do apologetics, it doesn't mean I apologize for, you don't have to use that joke anymore, because pretty much everybody knows what apologetics is. Now the challenge we have before us is these bad apologetics that are out there, that if you, like I said, that one week where you had general and special revelation, and this is the one I think you and your husband would really like to see. That general revelation is what scientists have access to in other fields too, but science for sure, they're studying the physical world. And the Christian apologists who say, you can't trust science because it's fallen humans that are doing it, noetic effects of sin, things like that, or the creation is cursed. That means that you can't trust your senses, you can't trust scientific inquiry, which means it's not objective now. Well, what is it? Well, it's your testimony, it's your subjective. There are a lot of Christian apologetics ministries and organizations out there, not the majority of them, but some of them are really large and really successful, that are saying that, and I think that's very dangerous. So I recommend against it. What's that?
What about Newton?
Oh yeah, they're not consistent. In fact, do you guys know who died today? Jerry Newcomb. You know who that is? He was the theologian who co-wrote the Genesis flood with Henry Morris. And he was a presuppositionalist. And I had a really, let me get that quote, because I'll put it on the screen for our final God's character. Okay, look at that quote. I just want to show you this because I don't want you to think I'm making this stuff up, okay? This is a very, if not the most popular apologetic site in the world. So if we turn to the Bible as our highest authority in every area, including how we do apologetics or how we defend the Bible itself, we will discover that we can appeal to no greater authority than God himself. If we had to appeal to another authority to prove what God said, in other words, prove that the Bible is true, which is what we're doing here, classical apologetics proves that the Bible is the Word of God. He's saying, if we do that, then God wouldn't be our ultimate authority, but our proofs would be our ultimate authority. That's presuppositionalism. Now, the things that I think are horrible about that, number one, if you're saying that you defend the Bible itself by its own authority, now you've got the dog chasing its tail. Bible's the Word of God. Why is that? Because it says it's the Word of God. Well, how do you know? How do you trust that? Well, because that's the Word of God. God can't lie. Well, how do you know it's the Word of God? Well, because it says it's the Word of God. That's literally what he's doing. It's how do you hand that to somebody who's seeking? They're going to look at you like you're a dog chasing your tail. That's why when I say it's dangerous, it hurts evangelism. Just on that one level alone. Then there's this other thing called bibliolatry, which is not talked about very much, but it's sneaky. It comes in sometimes. I've said things that qualify as bibliolatry. Who is worthy of our worship? That trick question. God, right? Yahweh, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. God we worship. Why? One reason we know that we don't worship anything else is that if there was no creation, no people to worship God, he would still be worthy of it. If there was no creation, there would be no Bible. There would be no need to reveal if there was no fall. Maybe he would have revealed himself. I don't know if he would have needed to. Garden of Eden. Christians sometimes will talk about the Bible and assign attributes to the Bible that only belong to God Almighty. And again, they don't mean anything. What they mean by it is, this is the only holy book, not the Quran, not the Book of Mormon, not a science textbook. This is the only written word that God has infallibly revealed to us. But I'll talk to you. You haven't come, and we'll talk about chemistry. That'd be fun.
Back next week.
You will?
Yeah.
Cool. But you see the subtleness in there? Like, worship the Bible. I know that's not what they mean, but they talk about the Bible that only you're only supposed to look out in that way. And in the Bible, when it says the Word, again, was the Word, that wasn't the Bible. That was Jesus, or the Son. That's God they're talking about there. So